Okay, thank you very much for your kind invitation, and I think that as an Italian woman probably were among the best all over the world concerning the gestural automatic activity as Berlusconi or Renzi. I discovered that this kind of automatism is called Italian automatism. And I also discovered no automatism, no party. So we are here for having a party. Okay, so we can start from the very beginning. If I'm able to go to the next one. Okay. So we have a very ancient historical description, and at the very beginning they considered that automatic movement was just postictal phenomena, but except in psychomotor seizures, so seizures starting from the temporal lobe, originating there, or in the absences seizures. And also Penfield described three types of epileptic automatism, in temporal, in frontal, and again during petit mal episodes. And of course, frontal lobe epilepsy was identified to cause as well generalized motor seizure, but also short-lived automatism characterized by stereotypic thinking or behavior. But I think that everyone among us, and probably also me, consider that about 90% of seizure with automatism are starting from the temporal lobe. And they put into evidence that probably there were something in the periamygdaloid area, so in the very medial part of the temporal lobe. But Jackson in 1881 suggested that probably for the onset of this kind of movement, we need some subcortical center. So everything was already written, because also kids with the anencephalopathy without a brain can present such kind of automatism. So we are going to look at the gestural and the grasping and the sexual activity, but I'm very afraid that probably the responsible cortical zone for every kind of this automatism remains largely unknown. And few papers, because at the very onset it was a medical legal problem. So you are doing something, but are you conscious or not? So you have the will to perform this kind of motor activity or not. If you have the will, you can be judged then about your activity. And they state that automatism were an activity, complex activity with a state of impaired consciousness. And they consider normal the automatism that we have when we are in hypnosis, organic in temporal lobe epilepsy, psychogenic or feigned. And again, 1998, the semiological seizure classification by Elie state, this one was by Luders, that again, automotor seizures, so seizure with automatism, are complex motor seizure, and that consciousness was quite always affected during this kind of behavior. Again, 2001, this kind of activity occur when cognition is impaired. And then Tassinari state that probably we need some subcortical strata for this kind of automatisms. So we have a lot of innate behavior in our subcortical structures, but we need a cortical point of the start of the discharge. And this is just because it's one of the few papers in which they try to differentiate non-manipulative and manipulative automatism late in comparison of the automatism, or they appear at the very onset of the seizure. And in this very beautiful works, 2014, we have some what they call proximal stereotypy and distal stereotypies that we can probably call as automatism, and they belong to the group number 4. So group number 4 is the one in which the frontal lobe is really strictly connected with the temporal lobe. And this is the last classification, 2017, and I found that they put there some very bizarre form of automatism, so aggression, high blinking, running, undressing. So if I dress is not an automatism, if I undress is an automatism. And they also state that they occur when cognition is impaired. But probably we may perform every kind of automatism with our consciousness that is preserved. And I also find that it was a very beautiful description of temporal lobe sexual seizure. It was a female, and she has this kind of itching in the perineum and a feeling like a red hot poke poker was being inserted into her vagina, and the hot sun was descending onto the face, and then she would spread the legs apart, beat with both hands on her chest, verbalized her sexual needs, often in vulgarities. Unfortunately, she was operated on and she was seizure-free since surgery, but it's proof that probably sexual seizures started into the temporal lobe. And it's just for putting something in evidence, because I think that apart from papers describing the symptomatology using VDG or SAG or whatever you want, you can use intracerebral electrical stimulation, but you have to differentiate the results when you have the after discharge or when you have not an after discharge. And it's pretty beautiful because automatisms here are in dark blue, so we were not able to induce any automatic behavior with stimulation without an after discharge, but just with an after discharge, suggesting that probably we can stimulate into the temporal lobe. What we need is spreading of the electrical activity to have this kind of behavior. I started with automatism and epilepsy, so I find out 2,300 of papers, so at that moment I stated that not to come in paros, but then I put all the R and DO and whatever, and I did find this number of publications, so gestural, proximal, or distal. These are the numbers, 12 and 28 for genital and sexual, then I put them together, and 153 for grasping. Any number and age, full text available, of course in English. There were some very beautiful papers, but not in English, not in Italian, of course. And I choose them because the patient were operated on with or without invasive recordings, with the lesional clear-cut on the MRI. But I also choose the series with VDG recordings because I think that the biggest series are papers in which the patient are studied just with VDG recordings. That is a big problem because I think that everything that we are convinced to know about the symptomatology is based just on this kind of papers. And it's very difficult to assess if they are true or not, because when they stated that we are faced with temporal lobe seizure without invasive recordings and without operating on the patient, it's probably very difficult to assess. And of course, we have to take into account also papers talking about stimulation during invasive recording, but as I told you, subdividing with or without after discharges. So these are the numbers. At the very end, I selected 35 papers with a very big number of patients, so more than 1,700 patients. And just for remember to you what we are talking about. Oh, it doesn't work. It's beautiful. Yeah, you can start both. Okay, so they are both temporal lobe epilepsy. I can start now. Okay, look at the right hand. This is a temporal lobe, a right temporal lobe seizure. So we have what we can call the triad. So the orientation of the head homolateral automatism with the right hand, and the dystonia of the contralateral head, that is the left. So that's what we call an automatic movement that is distal with the hand, and the hand in this case is ipsilateral to the epilepsy. This is another one. The seizure is already started. He has his sensation, and then look at his right hand is rolling a pill or counting money, as we said in Italy. So these are okay, and at the same moment he has alimentary automatisms. Okay, but we may have automatism bilaterally located. This one is a give me 5 automatism, it's okay, and then he's laughing. As it was very amazing that he has the 5, give him the 5. And in this case, we may have bilateral automatisms with both hands and arms, and also alimentary automatism, and without loss of consciousness. So at that time, at the very onset of the seizure, the patient is aware and is able to answer to the question, to the denominator, but at a certain point, she loses her consciousness, continuing to have automatism during the seizure. So we can see that we may have different type of automatism. This is another kind of temporal lobe epilepsy. on the dominant side and look at her right hand. The sound is not connected to the video, okay. So she started with tapping and then she screamed. I was convinced for months that she has a psychogenic seizure, but then she was really frightened because she has a literal hallucination, okay? And unfortunately, the automatism was not always the same during her seizure, so it was dependent on the position and the ambience from which she was surrounded. Okay, so these are the results, and it was really very difficult because in multiple papers it's not clear if how many children, how many adults, it's not clear how many patients has a positive MRI. If the MRI was considered as positive, it was impossible to know which kind of lesion and where the lesion were located. Then we have a lot of patients submitted to SEEG or invasive recording, and not a lot of patients that were operated on. And when also the patients were operated, we were not able to know the percentage of patients seizure-free, or even if the follow-up was at least more than 1 year. This is the first page. This is the second one. In light pink, you have a paper in which they consider just the results of the electrical stimulations. And as you can see, it's very difficult to assess. And these are the summary in gestural automatism because I subdivided in 3 the different results. And as you can see, the high or very high confidence in the location of the epileptogenic zone was reached just in 34% of the paper, and concerning not more than 400 patients. So I think it's very difficult, and even they suggest that the majority of automatisms can start into the temporal lobe, but anyone knows where into the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is a very big one. Also, there are moderate possibility that you may have also automatism starting from the frontal lobe, and a moderate possibility that you may have both frontal and temporal lobe for the genesis of this kind of behavior. And concerning the sexual seizure, we have very few papers, so sometimes it's very difficult to assess if this kind of movement, so she put her left hand on the perineum, this is a sexual activity or is it just an automatism, a gestural automatism in the wrong place or in the correct place, I would say. And, and this is a very amazing behavior, but this is a post-ictal, okay? So she had very long seizure starting in the non-dominant, but it's for sure a sexual activity. So, and for sure she wants, he doesn't want, and it was very complicated because she loses her trousers and then he will lose her trousers as well. So it was a very long activity, but she was really convinced, so it was complicated. Okay, and we have, of course, less studies concerning the sexual activity, so just 9. And here again, it was very difficult because, again, it was very difficult to assess how many adults, how many kids, the age of the adults, the age of the kids. Again, this was a mess about the possibility to have a lesional MRI, patients that were submitted to a SEEG or whatever. So at the very end, again, we have 45% of possibility to have a very high confidence in the epileptogenic zone. And I think that we are at the same level because quite half of the patient had for sure temporal lobe epilepsy and the other half have frontal lobe epilepsy. So I have no answer about the sexual activity. It's amazing, but it's not clear. And concerning the grasping is so beautiful. So you can induce a grasping with the electrical stimulation, as in this case, in a non-epileptogenic cingulate gyrus. Usually is in the anterior or medial part of the cingulate gyrus. He was absolutely surprised. So you may have an activity, a motor activity without your will. Okay, so we can induce a patient to perform a behavior, a motor behavior, without her willing. And if we stimulate the contralateral cingulate gyrus, we integrate the grasping. He grasped the cable into the phenomenology of the seizures. And sometimes, again, we can induce different kind of grasping, this different shape of the arm, as in this case he is counting, and he's trying to keep something on the sheet, but there is nothing on the sheet. And also you can perform an electrical stimulation with a different setting. So you put something in front of the patient and you stimulate again the cingulate gyrus, again is and you have a movement of the mouth and then a grasp of the fruit and then again movement toward the, and then of course she's screaming because she's acting without will. And it's very important. Here we have a lot of studies with intracerebral stimulation that probably are really beautiful for defining, in this case, the parcellarization, for example, of the cingulate gyrus, because they find out finally that, again, this study, so the number 3 and the number 5, with really a lot of patients that we can establish that grasping can be put it in the anterior and medial part of the cingulate gyrus, and this one with patient, the last one with patient operated on and absolutely seizure-free after the surgeries. Again, they may have grasping just when seizures start in this part of the cingulate gyrus. These are the summary, and again, we are 45% of possibility to be confident, and I think that probably this is one of the only signs in which we have high possibility to identify the origin of this kind of behavior, motor behavior. We have just 1% of patients that in which we may have a grasping with a discharge that is in the parietal part of the cingulate gyrus. So always the cingulate gyrus, but in this case, the parietal part. So if we had to conclude, we can state that probably, if we know very well our patient, the gestural automatisms are most probably located on the temporal lobe. There is not a prevalent side. We do not know if they are early or late during the seizure, but they are more probable during the second part of the seizure. Probably we may have somehow some homolateral gestural automatism, but more frequently they are contralateral and they could be also bilaterally. Concerning the sexual, of course, we have no differences in between a frontal or a temporal genesis, not a prevalent side. They are probably late on during the seizures, and homolateral, contralateral, bilateral, we do not know. And for the grasping, of course, probably we can state that we are faced with the cingulate or mid-frontal origin of this kind of motor behavior, not a prevalence of the side, and we do not know if they are early coming during the seizure or in the latest part. Homolateral that are infrequent, they are more contralateral, and they could be also bilaterally. And these are the resuming, and I think that they are present also in patients having medial temporal lobe or lateral temporal lobe. We have it with the intracerebral electrical stimulation just in patients in which we induce, of course, the behavior, but also an after discharge. So you have to put in your mind that probably they are linked to a propagation to the cortical discharge to, I don't know, subcortical or other cortical structure, and they are also present in kids, and these are the not very important determining data for the sexual and probably yes for the grasping activity. But we have to recognize that we have really some weaknesses, and the symptom is not for sure a seizure. And the isolated clinical data are not enough, and it was very difficult to do the analysis of the literature because we have a really uneven papers and often with very little data. And I think that probably our future is dedicated to the results that we may have with the intracerebral electrical stimulation. And I think that this is one of the most beautiful automatisms. The patient had a cluster of seizure, it was completely aphasic. My colleague is saying that don't move, stay there. And it was the answer. Thank you very much.